Thanks, Anne. And I'd also like to thank Anne and Svenja and Luke and the other directors for the work that they're continuing to do to maintain the spirit and ethos that I remember from studying at the Centre for Human Ecology in 2005, 2006. And I feel a bit reticent about being on the panel because I don't consider the work that I'm doing at the moment to be human ecology, although I know that if I can only do the work that I'm doing because of my experience of and training in human ecology at the Centre for Human Ecology, and I also hope that the work that I'm doing might be useful for people who are doing community-based work that I think of as human ecology, even if some of them may not use that term themselves. And I think for me, the more comfortable thing for me to do is to speak to my experiences on the course, so to give people to remember and to share what the Centre for Human Ecology was doing on the MSc course circa 2005, 2006 when I was there. And my journey into human ecology in that way. So my background is I come from the Isle of Skye. I grew up in a traditional family that was in a community in a parish that was turning its back on Gaelic culture, and the idea was very much that any young people who were there, and it was a community at that time mainly of older people, that young people were to move away from the island. If you stayed, you were a failure. If you moved away, you succeeded. And I think I carried that with me all through my life, a sense of division within myself as to where I was coming from and who I was. And my experiences in education up to the Masters didn't really help me to resolve or even to be aware of that division and what was the cause of it. And then through a chance meeting with Alistair McIntosh in the Meadows during the Make Poverty History campaign in 2005, the big march, after having read Soil and Soul and meeting Alistair, I embarked on the MSc in Human Ecology. And my recollections of the beginning of it was the year that CHE moved from being independent, accredited by the Open University, to being at the University of Strathclyde. So I was there when we shifted the table in the library and bits and pieces through. And then we began the course, not in the institution itself, but in a big old building, not dissimilar to this in some ways, near the university. And I can't remember the name of it, but it was like an old school. And I'm sure it was a conscious decision by the course directors to kind of remove us from the institution a little bit. And one thing I remember about it was that going up the stairs, there was a little notice that said something like, if your vocation is also your vacation, you've got it made. And it just sort of had a better feel than being in the institution. And the first morning when we were there, it was on a Saturday, we just sat in a circle and talked to each other, which was kind of a revolutionary moment for me in education, because particularly in higher education, I'd never had an experience where in the curriculum, the first thing to do was to get to know who your fellow students were. And so we sat there, and one of the first things we did with Varen and Nick, who, there were a lot of tremendous experiences in that course. I was taught by Ool, I was taught by Dave Key, by Jennifer Batty and others, but really at that time, Nick and Varen were the kind of really the beating heart of the course, because they held the core sessions in which community was created. So one of the first things that we did was to draw up a learning contract, which was really how we wanted to be with each other, how we would talk to one another, how we would respect each other and the opinions that were shared. And that acquired a lot of depth over time as we got to know each other better. It was a really good thing to do at the outset. And I remember at the very beginning, Robert Swinfen talking about work he'd been doing in the Gorbals, and I made some comment about the Gorbals being a rough area based on my very limited knowledge of Glasgow, thinking it was amusing, and then afterwards thinking actually that wasn't a kind thing to say, and speaking to Robert afterwards in one of the breaks, and apologising and saying, I didn't mean anything untoward by that. And Robert, of course, responded with the gentleness that I later came to learn is characteristic of him. But even then, I could see, from a background in studying linguistics, I was understanding language in a new way, the healing, the potentially hurtful but healing power of the word. It was right there from the outset in terms of how we were to be with one another. Another experience in those early days was we played a lot of games, which I think Varen and Nick had drawn from Augusto Boal's games for actors and non-actors. And it was, again, really effective. And I'm sure they couldn't have understood the different ways it would work on people, but they had a power in the meaning of the game itself. So one of them, we split into pairs, and I was in a pair with Jude Lally, who's next door doing a workshop at the moment. And Jude was a stranger to me. I hadn't known her for more than a day at this point. And the idea was that one of us put on a blindfold and the other person had to guide them around the room and through the corridors upstairs. And my goodness, suddenly was a person who was basically a stranger to me, who'd been deprived of, an important part of her sensory apparatus. I was responsible for her. And it really hit me, the responsibility that we have for others in our lives, in our encounters with people who may be strangers to us. Just a deep power in the exercise itself that goes beyond what you might think of as two people wandering about a space, one of them with a blindfold on. During that week, we also visited sites of ecological contestation, I suppose you would say. I remember going to Greengares, which was a village in Lanarkshire, which I think had 2 or 3 big dumps that were getting bigger and bigger around about it, and speaking to the women there, and the really visceral experiences of the heavy lorries travelling through the town, constantly, it seemed, the smells that would come from the sites at time, the fear of the contaminants and the pollutants that surrounded them. And then we went to visit the site itself and spoke to the manager, who said, well, we don't want to grow bigger, but for as long as we're part of a society that relies upon waste, built-in obsolescence, we need to be here. And so we were learning there were no simple answers. These are complex questions. The same applied to the motorway extension that we spoke to councillors involved in promoting it. We spoke to activists against it. We spent some time dividing the centre of Glasgow into areas and learning about those areas and then sharing what we'd learned. It really tickled me that Jenny Patient and I were learning about the Merchant City, and we learned that Buchanan Street used to be part of what was called the Long Croft in the 16th century, and the herdsman would take the cattle up Buchanan Street to Cowcaddens, which was the cow pasture, and it was just incomprehensible to me as coming from a crofting community in Skye that actually 400 years ago that's what was here. And again, the power of collaboration in that we could build up a picture of the history of this area by taking little bits of it. And then the tour around Glasgow, where we met the Queen Bee of a close, who invited us in and showed us all around the close. These little moments that just kind of happen. And then at the end of the week, the introduction of Manfred Max Neef's ideas of our fundamental human needs, and the question of how are your needs being met just now, which was a pretty shattering experience in terms of really thinking about the range of needs that we have and how our current society values or allows us to meet those. But being able to be shattered by that, because already at that point, within the first week, you were in a space where you'd built relationships with people where you could talk about those things. That is still, and I'm speaking as someone who works at a university, very, very much on the margins of education. I'm part of an MSc course, and I'm the co-lead of a module called Power, Participation and People's Knowledge, and we try to, our first sessions are humanizing sessions. It's as participatory as we can make it, but we're an outlier. That isn't what's happening. And yet for me, that fundamental transformative experience is based on the building of community. So you're not an empty vessel to be filled. You're bringing all your experiences and interests to it, and you develop that in collaboration with the experiences and the interests of others. That's where education has to be. And just another couple of things I'd like to share one experience in particular in the participatory action research class that Nick was teaching. I think it was the first class, first week. There were 16 of us, 8 CHE folk. It was term 2, so the Centre for Human Ecology people were already getting pretty chilled by this point. And then we had 8 masters in social research, sort of journalism students, quite hard-nosed, data-driven, and they were pretty suspicious of the whole Centre for Human Ecology vibe. Nick walks into the room, and this is in the institution. It's a classroom in Strathclyde, way up high in a building, 4 lines of seats, teacher's desk at the front. Nick comes in, he's a few minutes late, and he says, "Morning, how are you all feeling today?" And there's a few grunts, and yeah. And Nick says, "No, I'm asking how you're feeling today. How are you feeling in this moment? What are you experiencing? How is it for you right now?" And you could just feel the discomfort, particularly in the social research students, with the worst hippie kind of suspicions that they had of the CH. And Nick just sat with that, asking variations of the same question. It felt like about half an hour, but it was probably only 5 minutes, until finally somebody said, "Well, I can see the back of a dozen people's heads." And somebody else said, "I heard a voice. I can hear the traffic outside. It's really dark in here." And within about 5 or 10 minutes, we'd unpacked the whole dynamics of the room and the educational assumptions, and we were sitting in the circle, and that set the dynamics for the whole class. And it was a really brave, I still feel it was a really brave piece of teaching that shifted things so that I think even the social research students recognized that we could do something a little different. And then finally, the final assessment was a group assessment. I was in a group with Nikki Bartlett, Spencer Lloyd-Pack, and Zoe Palmer. And our assessment was really talking through what we'd learned on the course and sharing that in a sort of presentational way. And we made it quite performative because we were quite an artsy group, the others perhaps more so than me. And for me, a big part of the journey had been my experiences with salmon. I'd worked on fish farms. I'd written sort of political advocacy about the social and ecological harms of fish farms in Scotland and the takeover of the Scottish industry by the Norwegian multinationals backed by the state, and also of my own experiences working on the fish farms, very dehumanizing experiences of slaughtering fish and the process of becoming part of the industrial food system, and also of the mythos of the salmon in Celtic tradition, of the source of knowledge and of the salmon returning to the source, returning to the home river. And as part of that, Zoe made a salmon, and we used it in the presentation, and afterwards she gifted it to me, and I've got it with me here. I haven't got a food blender in this box. I've got Zoe's gift, and also Ul talked about the graduations under the yew tree, and the little sliver of yew. I brought that with me as well, so I'll bring it out of the bag once I put this microphone down. Just these are the things that we carry, and so even when we move on, and we may not be sort of directly even feeling that in our day-to-day work we're doing human ecology, that spirit, it still calls to us, and that for me was the essence of my experience at the Centre for Human Ecology. The building of relationships of trust and of care, and the skill with which that was done, that became a place of love. And that is the place where transformation, when you get to that level of trust and care and love, that makes transformation possible. And for that experience, I am forever grateful. Thank you.